Hi Vox, quick video to just talk about this new MCP spec update. So MCP was released exactly a year ago, and on their 1 year birthday, they released this spec update, and it has a number of very important updates, all with an eye towards making MCP more realistic, more convenient, more robust in production agent deployments. So I wanted to take a quick look at some of the big new pieces of functionality they have added to the spec. Actually, this article from WorkOS is a quick high-level overview of the new things they've added, so I'll quickly skim over this. The biggest thing, in my opinion, by far, and they call this out too, is support for asynchronous long-running tasks. Now, one of the big engineering annoyances with rolling out MCP in production currently is that if you call an MCP server, if you call a tool on an MCP server, that takes a very long time to return. And that often is the case because tools themselves will use LLMs or do long running tasks. It is then a pain for the MCP client to maintain and babysit this connection over that long time interval. So this is a very welcome change. So this essentially gives you an abstraction that lets you handle long running tasks. So if you have a request like this is calling get weather, and you have a TTL on the task, the response will include a task ID and its current status. But once you have this task ID, you can then poll, and the status will move from working to completed, etc., etc. And so you have this way of managing the state of long running tasks. And this is helpful because even if your client disconnects and then reconnects, as long as you have the task ID, you're able to work with that long running task and you won't lose track of it. So that is one really welcome update. The next few changes have to deal with authorization and controlling permissions. The biggest one in that bundle is how they've simplified the use of OAuth. And the goal here is to establish some kind of trust relationship between an MCP client and an MCP server that have not seen each other previously. So if you just imagine, say, GitHub exposes an MCP server at, say, mcp.github.com. Now, the thing is, how would GitHub control who is allowed to connect to that MCP server? And previously, that was very messy. In this new OAuth technique, the trust is based on the URL. So, as they say over here, if you trust the domain, you trust the client. And this is also good for the client because you have this one common way, client.json, that's hosted on the server that lets the client understand what the server is capable of. And the trust boundary is piggybacking on DNS. So the fact that you connected over HTTPS to github.com lets you trust that the MCP server is coming from github.com. And it works the other way around too. For github.com, it can see the originating server of the client that is making the call, and it can authenticate based on that. So this really makes it much easier and allows trust to be established in a much more decentralized way. The next big one that I'll talk about is default scopes, and this is in this SEP. SEP stands for Spec Enhancement Proposal, something like PEP for the Python world. So what is a scope? So up until now, MCP didn't have this notion of scopes. But if you've worked with REST APIs, this notion of scope is very common in REST APIs. It essentially delineates permissions or the kinds of actions you are allowed to do. Again, if you take the GitHub example, if they stand up an MCP server and I as a client connect to it, is my client allowed to read repos or write to repos Is it allowed to read issues? Is it allowed to create new issues? And so on. So each of those actions, read repo, write repo, so on, that is a scope. So when my MCP client connects to an MCP server, it is able to follow an established auth protocol to request the scopes that it needs or wants, and for an authorization server to then up level my permissions based on my ID if I'm allowed to give me those scopes. So this obviously is a big unblocker for more powerful servers to be able to expose the right kind of functionality to the right kind of clients without worrying about unnecessarily exposing overly general permissions to everyone. This next one is kind of a meta concept, which is how do you evolve the spec itself? And they're introducing this notion of extensions, which is kind of the way that you optionally add experimental things to the spec. So an extension to the spec is not a part of the official core spec. It is understood by the ecosystem to be an experimental thing, but nonetheless, it is specified. So different servers and different MCP clients may or may not choose to support various extensions. But if they do support an extension, then you will have a spec for it. So this is a great way for the community at large to propose cool new additions to the spec without needing everything to go into the core spec. And over time, if an extension becomes popular enough or vetted enough, or there's agreement in the community that this extension is now well designed and solid enough, it can move into the core spec. The most notable example of an extension is this MCP Apps extension proposal, which kind of formalizes the protocol that apps in ChatGPT uses. So apps in ChatGPT use this extension to render the UI for apps inline within a chat. And then let me wrap up with a couple of miscellaneous but still very interesting additions. This one, M2M, machine to machine. This allows MCP clients and servers with no human in the loop. So you still have OAuth credentials, but these are more for cron jobs or background agents. And so they can still have identities and scopes without needing a human in the loop, machine to machine, as the name says. This one is cool too, sampling with tools. So MCP has this notion called sampling or elicitation, which is when the server can ask the LLM at the client for a completion. And it was kind of a weird omission that when it did that, the client didn't support tool calling, but now it does. So now that you can sample the client's LLM and then use the client's LLM token billing to sample with tool calls, it opens the gate for servers to do much more agentic workflows while letting the client bear the cost, which was an important operating model to unlock. And then a couple of quality of life, nice to have improvements. The tool names are finally standardized. There's a spec for how the SDK itself gets versioned. And finally, they have a formalization of what they're calling MCP bundles, which is a way to package up an MCP server. So that was a pretty significant update right on the 1 year anniversary of MCP. It's definitely moving in a great direction. All these updates will really unlock a lot of new use cases, especially enterprise use cases that really need better permissioning and better authorization and authentication. So this is great to see. MCP is rapidly becoming kind of the everything protocol for LLMs. So yeah, hope you enjoyed that. Thanks.